Now let's talk about Ray Epps and the latest Biden administration attack on First Amendment rights of comedians. Joining us now is Darren Beattie. He is a former speechwriter and policymaker for President Donald Trump, who holds a PhD in political science from Duke University. He's currently the founder of Revolver.News, which does a lot of coverage of January 6th. Darren, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I first want to talk about the January 6th report. Obviously there's the report that came out. It's got its bias. You've written, as part of the Skyhorse Publishing, the publication of that report, you've written a big, long sort of counter to some of the narratives that kind of came out. Can you kind of give us an overall, what were the big fallacies that you felt were in the report, and what is the truth?
Absolutely. I'll give you the extremely condensed version. And so,
Okay.
people may have heard of the January 6th committee, and it's often touted as a bipartisan committee. But effectively, what that means is it's comprised of Democrats who hate Donald Trump and his supporters, and a handful of Republicans who hate Donald Trump and his supporters even more. That's Liz Cheney and the crybaby Adam Kinzinger, who I say spends more time crawling on all fours than he does on 2 feet. But this version that we've put out through Skyhorse, made different publication houses have published this public document that the committee produced with various journalists writing an introduction to it. There's only one version, and that's the Skyhorse version, that dared to solicit somebody to present the counter narrative. That is to say, the narrative that isn't shoved down your throat by CNN and other sort of more controlled outlets. And I think it's really important to get to the truth of January 6th, not just because the truth is important generally, but because of what the regime is trying to do with their false narrative of January 6th. I think it's important to understand that the regime is using their false insurrection narrative of January 6th to facilitate the weaponization of the national security state against the American people. And that's a very dangerous trend. And so, in short, this introduction that I've written, it's available in the Skyhorse version of the report. About half of it, a little less than half, is dedicated to dismantling the idea of the January 6th committee itself, basically demolishing the notion that this committee could ever have been a disinterested and neutral fact-finding vehicle to get to the bottom of January 6th. And then the second half, which is really kind of the explosive and juicy stuff that Revolver.News has gained national attention for, is dedicated to exploring the questions that get to the beating heart of January 6th that the committee was frankly set up specifically to obfuscate and ignore. And those are the questions that pertain to January 6th as what I call a Fedsurrection, meaning that had not it been for a handful of key critical actors on that day who are likely connected to the federal government and are being protected by the government, the conditions would not have been present for that rally to turn into a riot. And so we explore the case, the notorious case of Ray Epps, who is a household name because of our reporting, but other things that are arguably even more explosive and dark. And so for those with the stomach to digest it, because it's not for everyone. Some people have seen our reporting at Revolver.News. They said, I wish I'd never seen this. But for people with the stomach to digest it, I strongly recommend go and get this report, learn the truth, because what's at stake. And you can also go to Revolver.News and see the classic series on Ray Epps with all of the video documentation that will absolutely blow your mind. And it's impossible to see this and then look me or anyone else in the eye and say that January 6th is what the media and the Biden regime told you it is, because it's not.
Yeah, question about Ray Epps. We've seen Jamie Raskin, for example, say, to Thomas Massey, when Thomas Massey was asking, well, what about Ray Epps? And he says, oh, you guys are a bunch of conspiracy theorists. Leave this guy alone. He's one of yours. Leave him alone. Why are you going after this poor guy? Which is really interesting because the entire point of these investigations was to go after the people responsible for January 6th, right? And you've got Ray Epps actually saying, we're going to go in to the building. You got people around him saying, Fed, 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 like they recognized him right away. And yet
Right.
Democrats seem to be glossing over him. Do you think that the Democrats do you think they're in on it? They know who he is. They know, if he is an FBI guy, an informant, or, do you think they know and they're covering this up? Or do you think they've been told, don't worry about that guy, and they're just kind of saying, then we're not going to worry about that guy?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say because Democrats is such a broad term. I don't think that there was a memo sent from, say, the Department of Homeland Security to all, elected officials of the Democrat Party saying Ray Epps is a Fed, don't talk about it. I think generally speaking, politicians in particular, but people are very good at catching on to what narratives they're supposed to cling on to and what they're supposed to stay away from. I think there could be some Democrats who have more of an inkling of what's actually going on, specifically Adam Kinzinger, whom I mentioned, who's never met a Trump supporter that he didn't want to see rotting in prison for 50 years. He actually, in the committee's interrogation of Epps, which recently became public, it's clear that he is a more aggressive defender of Ray Epps than Epps' own lawyer, who is incidentally a 9-year veteran of the Phoenix FBI field office. In fact, Kinzinger bizarrely bends over backwards multiple times to offer the most implausibly charitable interpretations of Epps's many inconsistencies and lies, to the degree that even it's apparent that other members of the January 6th committee find it bizarre. But again, people are very good generally at taking social cues, especially politicians, and they know what narrative they're supposed to take and what they're not. I mean, the fact is that Ray Epps' behavior was so egregious that he was one of the first 20 people put on the FBI's most wanted list for January 6th. The day after Revolver.News published the first piece presenting the thesis of federal involvement in January 6th, literally the day after, the FBI scrubbed his name from that. New York Times had previously villainized Epps. After that happened, the New York Times did a fully dedicated puff piece on Epps. And again, Adam Kinzinger, who's never, met a Trump supporter he doesn't want in prison, is, bizarrely defending Ray Epps more aggressively than his own lawyer. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't lend itself to any innocent interpretation. The only available interpretation is the obvious, dark, and disturbing one, which is that Epps is being protected, and he's being protected because he was not an authentic actor on January 6th.
Do you think it's possible that he was an authentic actor, but and not a Fed or affiliated with them in any way, or whichever organization? Maybe not the Feds, maybe something else, maybe some other branch. Do you think it's possible that he was a legitimate actor, but they don't want him to be the fall guy, or they don't want him to be the one responsible? They're actually looking for someone else to be responsible, namely Donald Trump. Very specifically, they're looking to put everything onto him, or people who were connected to him, advising him in some way. And maybe Ray Epps had literally no connection to him, and they just thought, well, that sucks. That's not the guy we want. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I mean, clearly the part of the political motive behind January 6th persecution is to neutralize Trump politically. And they do
Right.
that in the direct sense of kneecapping his political prospects, but in the more general sense of effectively labeling all Trump supporters as de facto domestic terrorists. But I don't think that accounts for the Epps thing because, again, Epps fits perfectly into the narrative that they want to promote. There's no reason to downplay Epps' involvement. If anything, the whole point was to gin up the severity of January 6th in order to more effectively smear Donald Trump. The more serious January 6th is. And so this guy offers them on a silver platter footage. It's really the only footage available of someone demanding people go into the Capitol in advance. He's this big guy in military gear wearing a Trump hat who's right there at the initial and decisive breach site. And furthermore, he happened to have been the president of the Arizona chapter of the Oath Keepers, which was the most demonized and aggressively criminally prosecuted militia group in relation to January 6th. So everything about it on the surface level lent itself to this plays exactly into the narrative that the media wants. It's $1,000 bill lying on the sidewalk, but instead of ginning that up, which originally they kind of did, they did this incredible 180 turn, incredible about face. And all of a sudden, he's the singular, he's the only January 6th participant about whom the New York Times will write a puff piece and whom Adam Kinzinger will defend.
I mean, it's definitely bizarre. And, really anytime they tell us, the ominous they, whether it be the liberal media or the politicians or security state, whatever, whenever they tell us not to look over here, that's where we should be looking. I mean, nearly every single time when they say, "Oh, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to see here. Stop talking about it. You're not allowed to talk about it. It's a conspiracy theory if you do." We've seen now more often than not that those conspiracy theories are not theories at all, but they're actually uncovering a real conspiracy that the government doesn't want us to know about. I mean, that's what we've seen over and over. So it is extremely suspicious. And they do it to themselves because they're so big on covering it up. And like you mentioned, this is the one guy we've got on video. And yet he's the one guy that they say, oh, don't pay attention to him. He's just a poor guy that you guys are targeting. I mean, it makes absolutely zero sense whatsoever. So really good point. I do want to move on and talk about the one thing that you have published on revolver.news. It's titled "The Most Important First Amendment Case You've Never Heard of. Biden Regime Tries to Toss a Young Man in Jail for 10 Years for Anti-Hillary Memes." Can you tell us about this? Who is this Douglas McKay? And what did he do?
Yeah.
What are they trying to get him for?
So this is an individual, a young man called Douglas Mackey, who is allegedly the real name behind the pseudonymous sensation of 2016 called Ricky Vaughn. He operated a popular Twitter account that there was some study conducted by MIT that determined that his Twitter account was more influential on the 2016 election than NBC and other mainstream outlets. And so he was a target, and he distributed a lot of memes, some of which were very funny, some of which were very controversial, some of which were both controversial and funny. But included in the host of memes that made this account famous and celebrated and notorious were memes along the lines of saying, "Oh, if you want to vote for Hillary, text this number." Basically, a commentary on the depressed average IQ levels of Hillary voters, such that they would be dumb enough to text something thinking that would be a vote. It was a clearly satirical thing, but the government's position under the Biden regime is that this is illegal misinformation and that it's an attempt to intimidate people from going to the polls when there's no evidence whatsoever that this dissuaded a single individual from voting. And so what's at stake here is not just the fate of this poor young guy. What's at stake is really what they're trying to do is to codify the disinformation scam into the criminal code, because I think a lot of people have been paying attention, have noticed that disinformation is the latest favored censorship predicate. When they want to censor something, they call it disinformation, irrespective of whether it's true or, in this case, of whether it has a clear satirical intent protected by First Amendment. And so the precedent at stake here is indeed very dire, because if this young man is convicted and if that is the precedent established, what that means is that people can go to jail for whatever the regime determines is disinformation, irrespective of whether it's true, irrespective of whether it has satirical intent. So I think it's a very dangerous case for those who care about the role of free speech in a robust and flourishing democratic process.
Yeah, so I guess we'd have to dive in a little bit more to this code. So he's been found in violation of 18 U.S. Code 241, the law which concerns conspiracy against rights, which was a
Hmm.
subset of the Enforcement Act of 1871, better known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. What was the
Right,
intention of that law, and now
right.
how are they weaponizing that?
Well, that's a great question. And I must preface this by saying I am not a lawyer and therefore not an expert on the legislative history of this. And so I'm sure that Mr. Mackey's counsel could give a much more legalistic account of this. But
Right.
based on my layman's interpretation of this statute, what it was, as you mentioned, it was the Ku Klux Klan statute. It was basically designed to prevent things like Ku Klux Klan blocking streets to prevent African Americans from being able to vote or intimidating people from being able to vote. There's simply no stretch of the honest imagination that could contemplate this statute encompassing and prohibiting satirical memes on the internet telling people, "Oh, if you want to vote Hillary, go text this number," which is a fairly conventional meme format. It's not unique to Mackey's production. It's something that has been around for a while as basically a statement that the people who support this candidate are really dumb.
That is extremely concerning. I mean, I am glad you are bringing this to the forefront for people because this is extremely concerning. There is a massive difference between intimidating, blocking, harassing people to where they don't feel like they can exercise their right to vote and just making a joke online and telling people, "Oh yeah, today's the day to vote and it's a Monday or voting's on Wednesday, that's when we everybody get out there and vote on Wednesday." Which is
Right.
obviously a joke, but it's also not intimidating. Sure, maybe it's misleading people. Maybe there will be some people that say, "Oh my gosh, I guess voting's been changed to Wednesday this week or something." I mean, I understand the concern that,
But
well,
the thing
people,
is, it's
right,
important to note that if that were indeed the case, the government would presumably present one case, but there hasn't been a singular case in this instance that the government has been able to provide of saying this person wanted to vote and did not vote as a result of being deceived by this meme. There would
right.
have to be a specific injury in order to make that case, and up to this date, the government has not provided one. So there's a question of if there were such an injury, would that still be First Amendment protected? But we're not even at that threshold because the government hasn't even proven a single case of that having happened.
Yeah, this is a very dangerous precedent. If they can get away with this, this is dangerous. They're telling it's as dangerous for every comedian that's out there.
Right.
I mean,
Well,
they'd
it's
have to really
already
watch
like
their
the
backs.
the sad fact of the matter is that even if Mr. Mackey is acquitted, which I of course hope that he is, a lot of damage is already done as a result of the chilling effect involved. It's like
Yeah.
think of the idea that before this, nobody, even in our kind of dystopian clown world, before this happened, I don't think I certainly, and I'm a very cynical person, very in tune with the unfortunate trajectory of our country, the disintegration of our liberties. I would never have imagined in a million years that somebody would be facing 10 years in prison for a funny Hillary joke meme, of which there were, thousands of memes, funny and unfunny, floating around the internet in 2016. That's just our world. But I never would have contemplated that somebody would be facing 10 years in prison for effectively mocking Hillary Clinton and her supporters.
Darren Beattie, thank you so much for being here. Darren Beattie, former speechwriter and policymaker for President Donald Trump, and
Thank you.
also the
And if I
founder
could
of,
say really
yes,
quickly,
yep,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry, if people are interested in this case, and I do think it's important, which is why we wrote about it, there is a website called Meme Defense Fund. So if people are interested in supporting the legal fund, because again, part of the damage is they screw these young people over with the legal fees. So even if he's acquitted, he's stuck with, I don't know how much it costs, but these things are not cheap to defend oneself when you're facing federal charges at that level. So memedefensefund.com if anyone is interested in helping out.
Excellent. Yeah. All right, Darren, thank you so much. Also, founder of Revolver.News and wrote the foreword to the Skyhorse Publishing version of the January 6th report. So, Darren, thank you again.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much.